the New York primary.
High-stakes primary in New York.
A critical contest for both parties.
Bernie Sanders having record-breaking crowds at his rallies. Hillary Clinton trying to avoid an embarrassing loss in her adopted home state.
New York would be a pivotal moment for both parties.
And victory is in sight.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Hillary Clinton, the U.S. news media, and the narrative of inevitability. Is it a self-fulfilling prophecy? The gloves come off in Bangladesh. 2 newspaper editors are accused of plotting to kill the Prime Minister's son and sticking a dagger into the future of the news industry, ad blockers, and the implications for journalism. At The Listening Post, we cover the way the news is covered, and viewers who have been with us throughout the U.S. primary season have seen plenty of examples of the American news media not only reporting political developments in the race for the White House, but playing a central role in them, particularly with Republican candidate Donald Trump. The media's preoccupation with Trump has not necessarily been ideologically driven. There's an economic aspect to this because, like him or hate him, Donald Trump does secure ratings for news channels that are struggling with their bottom lines. On the Democratic side, the lion's share of the news coverage, certainly at the outset, was dedicated to Hillary Clinton as opposed to her adversary, Bernie Sanders, who has drawn much bigger crowds than Clinton has and has higher approval ratings. Hillary Clinton does not provide the news networks with a ratings boost. However, what she does bring is the weight of the U.S. political establishment, as well as the tacit approval of Wall Street and her corporate backers, some of whom own news channels that produce coverage and the cable networks that provide those channels with their distribution. And this past week, when Hillary Clinton clinched that crucial victory in the primary in New York State, the dominant mainstream media narrative of her inevitability, her electability, was back. Our starting point this week is New York City. When Hillary Clinton delivered her victory speech this past Tuesday night in New York, New York,
there's no place like home.
the U.S. mainstream media could start spreading the news.
So Clinton obviously easily beat Bernie Sanders.
Game over was the consensus.
Almost impossible for Bernie Sanders to catch up.
The nomination was locked up. Not that we haven't heard that narrative on the American airwaves before.
Hillary Clinton is going to win the nomination has been the assumption of the news media in its entirety from the very beginning.
There's also the historic nature of her campaign. She is potentially the first woman president of the United States. That within and of itself, of course, draws a disproportionate amount of curiosity in the kind of campaign she's going to run, whether or not she can actually achieve that milestone. I think people have regarded this particular election cycle as her time, at least in the Democratic Party, and that's why you've seen this kind of media frenzy really grow around her campaign.
And when she loses, it's just a bump in the road that can be immediately forgotten. And when she wins, it's confirmation that her victory is inevitable. In yesterday's victory in New York, the articles and coverage of it could have been done 2 months ago, and it wouldn't have changed one iota.
At the start of his campaign, Bernie Sanders said he wanted to focus on economic and social issues. He kept his feelings on media coverage mostly to himself. That is no longer the case.
Almost everything that they have reported about this campaign has turned out to be inaccurate.
When challenged over the U.S. media's obsession with Donald Trump, American news executives can at least make the argument, as some have, that Trump delivers ratings and therefore revenues. But they cannot say the same of Hillary Clinton, who failed to draw the huge crowds Sanders did and failed to match the record-breaking amounts of money that Sanders raised. Still, the corporate news media in the U.S. showered Hillary Clinton with coverage compared to her rival with the anti-corporate message.
There was one study in the New York Times that showed, in terms of free media, Donald Trump got roughly $1.9 billion in free media compared to about $700 million for Clinton and roughly $320 million for Sanders. I can't think of a stat that's a more scathing indictment on the media than that stat right there. Another study found in 2015 that the nightly news broadcast had roughly 320 minutes on Trump, had aired roughly 120 minutes on Hillary Clinton, and only 20 minutes on Bernie Sanders. That has an effect on who people vote for.
There is a lot of conversation among onlookers that there are vested corporate interests that somehow control the coverage. I personally don't see any real empirical evidence of this. When you look at the actual decision-making power between the corporate side and the actual people making editorial decisions, there really isn't much of a true overlap on the day-to-day decision-making.
When you have institutions that are owned by very powerful corporations, they don't have to walk into a newsroom and say, do this and do that necessarily. The culture makes it pretty clear, and editors, producers get with the program, or they get phased out of the newsroom at some point. It's a much more subtle and sophisticated arrangement than some sort of blatant autocrat marching into the newsroom and demanding a story get covered this way or that way.
Media bias is always very difficult to prove, right? It's ideology, and ideology is a very complex thing to unpack. But you would have to be, I think, incredibly dense or incredibly disingenuous to not acknowledge that the class interest of the media informs their coverage.
Proving media bias is difficult. Documenting relationships is not. OpenSecrets.org is a nonpartisan tracker of money in American politics. It has calculated campaign contributions to Hillary Clinton going back to 1989 and reports that through its employees and political arms, Time Warner, which owns CNN, has donated more than $600,000 to Clinton. The head of Comcast, which owns MSNBC, held a pricey fundraiser for her in June of last year. And The Intercept.com has reported that top Washington lobbyists working for both Time Warner and Comcast have also been collecting checks for the Clinton campaign. And as for those millennials who think that by getting their news from Vox Media or BuzzFeed somehow insulates them from the effects of corporate news, they need to think again.
For example, most people don't know this, but Comcast is virtually the sole investor in Vox Media. Gave him $200 million last year. Comcast also gave BuzzFeed $200 million last year. So this idea that even new media is disruptive is kind of misleading. These new media companies are largely still funded by these large corporations, so invariably, yes, that's going to influence the coverage.
This process began with more than 20 candidates in the two parties, and after months of campaigning, dozens of debates, and hundreds of hours of airtime, it appears to have come down to two names, Clinton and Trump. Americans have grown dubious of polls, for good reason. But over the last 9 presidential elections, going back to 1984, CBS News has surveyed Americans on how they see the candidates. And the only candidate to ever have a lower favorability rating than Hillary Clinton is Donald Trump. The two least favorably viewed presidential candidates America has produced in the last 36 years are now the presumptive nominees for their respective parties. Who bears responsibility for that? The parties that produce the candidates? The voters who cast the ballots? And what of the middleman? The institution that bridges the gap between politics and the electorate, the media.
Maybe it was too many candidates running for the Republican Party, and maybe there was a dearth of candidates for the Democrats, and so we're in a situation where there really isn't that much choice. The only people we can come up with are sort of these not so great candidates to run for President of the United States. But political scientists, communication scholars are going to be sitting around trying to figure out how we got here for a really long time.
This country has changed. The world has changed. And the traditional politics, the establishment politics, the corrupt system that we currently have is being increasingly rejected by an overwhelming majority of young Americans. And what the mainstream has missed, and the entirety of the elite news media have missed entirely.
I don't think that a lot of the liberal voters understand what income redistribution really is.
Is that what's going on in this country is very different than what they understand, in their Washington, D.C. cocktail parties.
But does Bernie Sanders really care about the future of the Democratic Party?
And in Manhattan and in the world of the wealthy and powerful they hang out in.
On the download now, our viewers weigh in on the coverage of the Democratic Party and the race for the White House.
So I would argue that the media have actually propped up Sanders' campaign. by continuing to cover his every rally and fundraising announcement and caucus win in some tiny state as if they had any meaningful bearing on who will be the next president of the United States. Sanders should feel fortunate that reporters who have run out of material on Hillary's emails or Benghazi have bothered to review his plans at all. Dennis Kucinich and Bill Bradley rarely received such a courtesy.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week, there's been an extraordinary twist in a story that's been developing for more than 2 years now in Bangladesh. Two news editors, well known for their opposition to Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's government, have been accused of plotting to kidnap and kill the Prime Minister's son. One of the accused, Mahmudur Rahman, has already been behind bars for more than 2 years now. He faces 75 counts of sedition after accusing the Prime Minister of corruption. We profiled Rahman back in 2013 when he was still in charge of an opposition paper called Amar Desh. His co-accused is Shafiq Rehman, the 81-year-old editor of a popular Bengali monthly magazine, Muchake Dil. He once worked as a speechwriter for the former Prime Minister, Khalida Zia, when the Bangladesh National Party held power. There are real concerns over press freedom in Bangladesh. 2 months ago, Mahfouz Anam, the editor of the Daily Star, the largest circulation English-language paper in the country, was charged with defamation and treason for accusing Sheikh Hasina of corruption back in 2007. Twitter has appointed its first ever managing director for the Chinese market, which is notable, given that the service is banned in China. Beijing's Twitter ban has been in place since 2009, but microblogging is big there. More than 200 million Chinese use a site called Sina Weibo, which operates with the approval of the government. And Twitter does have a small but loyal user base within the country. However, users must resort to online tools to circumvent the ban.
Hello, everybody.
The new managing director is Kathy Chen, and her resume will have drawn the attention of the authorities there. She is a former employee of the People's Liberation Army and also worked for a joint venture partly owned by China's Ministry of Public Security. According to Twitter, Chen will focus on sales and helping Chinese companies reach global audiences. Facebook is another media giant from Silicon Valley, USA, that's banned in China. Last month, its CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, showed that Facebook still wants into that market when he met with the country's propaganda chief, Liu Yunshan, in Beijing. The Turkish government, which has already taken issue with the German media and some satirical output there on President Tayyip Erdogan, has now turned its attention to the Russian news media, one outlet in particular, the Sputnik news agency. Sputnik is owned by the Russian government. Its website in Turkey was made inaccessible by the communications authority there on April 14th. 2 days later, a court in Ankara upheld the government's position, accusing Sputnik of being a threat to Turkey's national security. Then Sputnik's bureau chief in Turkey, Tural Kerimov, was denied the right to re-enter the country. His press credentials were revoked and his residence permit was canceled. Moscow and Ankara have been at diplomatic loggerheads over Syria, the Assad government, and ISIL. Have you ever wondered why it is that when you log on to read the news in the morning, those shoes that you were looking at the night before are right there alongside the article that you're reading? Online advertisers do have their ways of tracking you and your tastes. It's a new digital wrinkle, but advertising's always been a core part of the news business. Its importance to the industry has only grown with the advent of the internet. Since fewer and fewer people are buying publications, many of those publishers are now almost entirely reliant on advertising to stay in the black. We do not opt in. Online ads just happen, but there are ways to opt out. They're called ad blockers, apps that remove ads from web pages and prevent marketers from walking in your digital footprint. When ad blockers got their start 6 years ago, no one paid much attention because relatively few people, only the more tech-savvy among us, bothered to use them. But that user number now exceeds 200 million, and that poses an existential threat to online news outlets, their economic viability. Ad blocking software has since made its way onto devices. iPhone and Android both now offer it, and mobile phone networks are heading in that direction too. The fight back from news outlets has begun. Some sites are now blocking ad blockers, barring anyone who uses them from seeing their content. German media groups have even tried to sue the companies behind ad blockers, although they lost that case in court. The Listening Post's Paolo Ganino now on the rise of ad blockers and what they mean to the news business.
We've all been there. You click on a news link and an ad pops up. Videos play automatically, and you have no idea where the sound is coming from. Ads you didn't mean to click take you to pages you never meant to visit. And you can't go far without being reminded of the clothes you were browsing yesterday. That's why more and more people have turned to ad blockers, simple pieces of software that make all ads just disappear.
Ad blockers are a form of protest. The ad blocking thing is, on a very large scale, is a referendum on the state of online advertising and a very important check on a system that is grown really quickly without also being focused on quality and the user experience.
Online ads can do a lot of things to your browsing experience. It can slow down your computer, it can use up your mobile data on your phone, and it can just be generally unpleasant to look at, so a lot of people would prefer to just opt out.
And I think that's where we are now, is that the question about monetization has taken precedence over everything else, but now it's becoming much harder to say, you know, we're going to put this autoplay video ad on our page without also asking, well, how many people is this going to drive away?
There are over 200 million consumers today that use ad blocking around the world. That is a strong message to publishers that they can provide the content they work so hard to produce, but in a manner that's not abusive to the consumer. That is, in a manner that doesn't exploit data targeting and profiling and the use of data unbeknown to the consumer.
It's not just on our laptops or PCs. Marketers follow us wherever we go online. Last year, Apple took the battle against ads on the road, going mobile. The company announced that users could install ad blockers on their iPhones. Since then, Google has briefly dabbled with ad blocking on its Android platform.
When stuff sucks, make it right.
And Three, one of Europe's major phone carriers, has announced that it will start offering ad blocking at a network level in the UK and Italy.
It only takes one complaint from like somebody across the room for you to complain about an ad, and they come over and they're like, look at this thing I can install, and then you have an ad blocker and you don't have to think twice about it.
Installing an ad blocker on your computer is very easy. On mobile, the process can be a little bit more complicated, but definitely not insurmountable.
But every time someone installs an ad blocker, they're effectively driving another nail into the coffin of their go-to news outlets. Publishers, already fighting with budget cuts, are now losing up to a third of their online ads revenue to this kind of software. And they're fighting back. They're asking users to turn off their ad blockers, at least on news sites.
There's a term for this. It's the opposite of blacklisting. They call it whitelisting. Bild, the best-selling tabloid in Europe, cannot be accessed online if your ad blocker is enabled. Forbes, the popular business outlet, does the same. Other websites like The Atlantic and The Guardian have not barred readers using ad blockers yet. Instead, they appeal to the reader's conscience, requesting that they either switch off their ad blocker, make a donation, or better yet, subscribe. But Wired, the tech and pop culture site, takes an uncompromising approach. You either turn off your ad blocker or pay for the content.
Everything we do at Wired is supported by advertising. So from the idea of the long tail to crowdsourcing to our exclusive look inside the production of the new Star Wars movie, those all came supported by advertising. That's how we do what we do. I think people forget about the ad serving an economic function for the publications that are running them. So we wanted to open up that conversation with our users. What we launched at Wired was a choice for consumers. If you don't want to see advertising, that's fine. Please subscribe and support our journalism. Remove your ad blocker so you see our advertisement, and we'll show you our content for free.
Ad blockers are messing with the economic models of publishers, but you might wonder, what's in it for them? Where does their revenue come from? It comes from another form of whitelisting. AdBlock Plus the most popular software in the industry, with almost 150 million users, runs a program called Acceptable Ads, where they whitelist non-obtrusive ads from certain companies. Google, Amazon, and Microsoft all made it onto that whitelist. By paying big money to the ad blockers, the kind of money most publishers can't afford to spend. But blocking the ad blockers is not the way to go, says Roy Carthy. He has a vested interest, of course. He's the chief marketing officer of Israeli ad blocking company, Shine.
Publishers should see ad blocking as an opportunity to reset their relationship with their audiences, an opportunity to regain their trust. What we've seen with publishing is that whenever it met a challenge, for example, the crossover from print to digital, mobile, social, is that certainly some players found it challenging, but others overcame it and new ones came about. So really this is an opportunity for trust, transparency, and the creation of new solid relationships with consumers.
Publications need advertising to make money. Other methods have been shown to not work. So it is just driving publications away from the open internet onto platforms where they can sort of guarantee their life cycle. The alternatives to advertising are to put your content on Facebook or Google or a platform where the company that makes the platform can control the entire experience.
That's already happening. Facebook and Google host millions of news articles every day and have direct control over significant amounts of revenue from online ads. For instance, through Facebook's Instant Articles service, media outlets can publish directly to the network, putting them straight into our media feeds. The ad revenues, however, go straight to Facebook, which takes a cut and shares the remainder with the content creator. Ad blockers have yet to figure out how to stop these embedded ads, but you can bet they're trying. And if they fail, some predict that within 5 years, Facebook and Google will control 70% of online advertising in Europe.
Journalism is very expensive, and it's also never really been the thing that's made money to begin with. For most of the history of media, the money has really been made through the fun stuff, right? And the problem really is that advertising is not a great business, and it's actually, as the industry matures, the seams are showing even more where it's clear that it's not a great business. But the problem is the industry hasn't really found something to replace it yet.
They've tried subscriptions, no joy. Turned to ads, and users block them. Soon Silicon Valley giants like Facebook will be taking more and more of what revenue there is, leaving news outlets wondering, what should their next funding model be?
And finally, the news business is a bit like a carousel. Round and round it goes, once per 24-hour news cycle. But when the ride ends, news outlets often find themselves in the same place with no profits to show for their work. And the aforementioned ad blocking issue is just the latest in a series of revenue challenges that media entrepreneurs must face these days. We asked our animator in New York, Beini Huang, to capture and caricature the struggles of those who are still trying to climb on that carousel and make a go of it in the news business in the digital age. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.